came to Orthodoxy through my wife and very much through being exposed to Orthodoxy in this area, really, through Putna and through the other painted monasteries. They were really my sort of first initiation, if you like, into or introduction to Orthodoxy. And I think of all the places that you can be introduced to the faith, I think it's really definitely one of the most wonderful places. And also, I think as well, at this particular time of year, the monastery, the main church, which you can see in the centre, is dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God. So there will be, normally there would be a very large feast there on the 15th of August in a couple of days' time. It will be a little bit less so this year for obvious reasons. But yes, I think it's very pertinent to be talking about Putna at this time. So we're going to start with a little video just to give you a feel for the monastery and its surroundings and the kind of architecture and a little bit of the music as well and the chanting.
Sorry everyone, just give me a moment. Let's try again. Morys, if you take yourself off mute and you can share your presentation from there.
Sorry, I'd forgotten I was on mute. I'll just take over the screen sharing. I am, as Michael was saying at the beginning, I'm actually in Romania at the moment, and I am quite in the countryside. And so I am relying on the mobile phone network to use the internet, and streaming video, I think, is just about the limit of what it can do out here. But hopefully you can now see my screen. And the first thing I thought we would do is just very quickly orient ourselves. So whereabouts is Putna? Putna is right up in what is today the north of Romania. So it is, you can see this little black square here. Putna is right there in the Suceava county, close to the border with Ukraine, and it really is, I think, less than probably 10 miles, not even that, to the Ukrainian border as the crow flies. So it's a very different type of landscape to, say, the south of Romania or the coast. And it's in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, so that brown area that you can see that is cutting down through the middle of Romania is the Carpathian Mountain Range, which goes down through Romania, up through Ukraine and Slovakia and into Austria. So it's a sort of mountainous landscape. Suceava is the closest main town, and the county is also called Suceava. And in Suceava alone, in the town, I think there are something like 54 churches in the town itself. And in the county, I don't even know, but there are a huge number of churches in Bukovina, and many of them are very old. And quite a lot, I would say probably even the majority of the monasteries that are still standing are actually operative in some way. They actually are inhabited by monastics, which is really quite astounding, even if in some cases, there are only a small number of them. Oh, it looks like I've been joined by Andreea. Great.
Hello, good evening.
So, so basically we're up in the north of Romania, and we are actually at the moment, we are very close to Suceava. So on this map, I'm not sure if you can actually see the mouse cursor, but on the map here, we are somewhere in between Putna and Suceava, closer to Putna, I would say, at this moment. And it is part of the monastery is part of the Archdiocese of Suceava and Radovuz, and it's historically part of the region of Bukovina. The region of Bukovina, and it will become a little bit clearer why I'm giving you all of these maps a little bit later. Bukovina is something that exists historically, if you like, as a region. It doesn't really exist as a sort of actual region today, but it very much still exists in the cultural consciousness of the people around here, and even is used nowadays as a sort of marketing piece almost for products and things that are made in this area. And it's known very much for its painted monasteries in general, but especially for the painted monasteries like Voronezh or Homor or Arbore, and they have each of them their own particular style and particular color of painting. So we talk about Voronezh blue, and it was, as historically, I would not give you too much of a overkill on the historical detail, but Bukovina existed as a region between the 1770s and then up to the end of the First World War. So it really wasn't until 1918 that this part of Romania, this Bukovina, actually joined modern-day Romania. They just recently, in the last couple of years, celebrated 100 years of union with the rest of modern Romania. And Putna today is on the border with Ukraine. So you can see the little dots where I've marked it out. But historically, it was actually not at all the sort of northernmost part of Romanian territory, if you like. So actually, there are still many Romanians in the area on either side of the border. This is a modern day map of the ethnic distribution of the area. And you can see that there's, in that area, there are quite a lot of Romanians in Ukraine. There are some Ukrainians in Romania. Borders were not so fixed, I suppose, as they are nowadays. And there was quite a lot of population on either side. And the reason why I'm sort of mentioning all of this is because Putna has had and continues to have a a central role and significance in Romanian consciousness, but not just Romanians in Romania. The Romanians that are the other side of the border, the Romanians that are now, I suppose, in the Republic of Moldova. So the Republic of Moldova was at one point part of Romania as well, or part of Moldova at least as well. And it has this sort of place in the national consciousness. And indeed, when you go to Putna, we've often seen anyway, tourists and pilgrims coming from Ukraine and coming from the Republic of Moldova, because as we will see, some of the historical figures such as Saint Stephen the Great have and continue to have a significance even today to the people of those areas too. So you can see that the monastery is set in the Carpathian foothills. It is surrounded by quite a lot of woodland. It's surrounded by some of the land that the monastery actually uses for agricultural purposes as well. And you can see that just to the left of this picture is the actual village of Putna. So there was a village that grew up around the monastery, really. And today, if you go there, you'll see that it's there are obviously people who just live there anyway, but there are a lot of people who serve the pilgrims and the tourists that come to Putna. So there are places to stay, places to eat, all sorts of tourist bric-a-brac, and all of that type of thing as well. But what's quite nice, I think, about where the monastery is set is that it is nevertheless still slightly apart from all of that. There's kind of a long sort of driveway until you actually get to the monastery. So you still sort of feel as if you are exiting in some way the usual world, if you like, when you approach the monastery. One of the things that you might have seen in the video is that in many ways it looks, and certainly appeared to me when I first saw it, more like a castle than a monastery. It's a fortified monastery, and it has a number of towers, it has ramparts, it has look like arrow holes, I guess, as well. And the reason for that is quite typical in this area. Some of the other monasteries nearby, so there's the Dragomir Monastery in Suceava, near Suceava, the town, and that has also is very similar layout. It looks very much like a fortress. To some extent, Nyams Monastery as well also looks like that. And really that is a product of practical purpose, and it actually, as we'll come on to in some of the history in a bit, the monastery and many monasteries in the area were threatened with or came under attack during the Middle Ages and right the way through until sort of 18th century and even beyond. And so the reason was really to actually protect the monks, protect what they had in the treasury, in their collections, protect maybe even the locals and some of the people who worked for the monastery and worked around the monastery. And the towers would have been used as a sort of last refuge point, if you like, in case of attack. So they would actually retreat into the fortified tower if they looked out and saw the Tatars coming or something like that. So it's very much a fortified monastery. And one of the other things you might have noticed, and one of the things that I particularly like about the monasteries in this area, is that it actually has quite a Gothic style to it. This is not all too uncommon in Romania. In Transylvania you see a similar thing, but that's perhaps to be expected because it was for a very long time under Hungarian domination or influence, at least anyway. Whereas Moldova, as we'll explain a little bit in a minute, has been more or less independent. So where does that influence come from? Well, you can see it's not even just the windows. You can see even actually the tower, the steeple. It's all a sort of Gothic influence with maybe a sort of Byzantine influence too. It's almost like a synthesis between the two. And I always feel that when you are, if you came up to this window at the western side and you were looking at it, you might think you were in Winchester Cathedral or an Oxford College or something like that. But when you look up and you see that roof, you know, this huge wooden structure, and this roof that overhangs in this way that's just so unusual for something you might see in a Western church, at least in my experience anyway. It really is an interesting and quite a unique style. Again, the roof is a very practical purpose. It's because it snows an awful lot, and that essentially just protects the church. So where do those influences come from, and why the need to be so fortified, I suppose? Part of the reason, I'll take you back a little bit with this map, and sorry, it's going to be the last map. I've presented a lot of maps. Part of the reason is because the world looks a very different place when Putna was created, when Putna was first founded. So Putna's construction begins in 1466. And in the late 15th century, this part of the world looks a bit like this. Putna is sort of up here in the edge of the Principality of Moldavia, which I will use interchangeably Moldova and Moldavia. I know we tend to say Moldavia in English, but I'm so used to saying Moldova now I can't make myself say it. So Moldova has been an independent principality, if you like, for about 100 years at this time. So it's really quite new. It has emerged from Hungarian dominance mostly, and below it you have Romania, which we call in English usually Wallachia, which at this time is ruled by Vlad Cepes, so Vlad the Impaler, of Dracula fame, somewhat inaccurately. And Moldova is ruled by Stephen the Great, who we will talk about a little bit in a minute. So really the reason for Putna being fortified and so many other churches being fortified is due to constant threats from Turks, from the Tatars, from the Hungarians, from the Poles as well. The Polish Empire Polish kingdom is significantly larger than Poland is today, and there's actually quite a big Polish influence in this area as well. There are still some small Polish communities around this area as well, actually. And it's worth remembering as well that just before the construction of Putna, Constantinople has fallen to Turks. And so it's quite a sort of, the world that's at that time is quite unstable, I think. And so the influence from the Gothic side of things comes from the Hungarian influence, and it also comes from the German influence as well. So the Hungarians had invited, some you might be aware, they invited Germans into Transylvania to help protect the frontier of Transylvania. And that led to a number of German towns like Sibiu and Brasov and others in that area. And they brought with them the Gothic style of construction. And that's where that influence came from. So we see this sort of Gothic Byzantine synthesis. So if I try to flip to the next slide, there we go. So as I mentioned, it has its origins in the 14th century. And there is an old Putna Monastery. They talk about the old monastery sometimes when you go there. And it still stands. It's a very small wooden church moved from a place called Volovat, which is actually just down the road from where we are. And it was a burial place of the very first Moldovan ruler. And it was moved upon the orders of St. Stephen the Great. And then they decided to make a new monastery, which was constructed between 1466 and 69. And the legend is, in terms of how the monastery was constructed, was that Stephen the Great, who we'll talk about in a moment, the ruler of Moldavia at the time, took a bow and arrow, and he went up to the top of that hill over there, or a hill at least anyway, and he fired the arrow, and where the arrow landed, that is where they built the monastery. That's the legend anyway. So good shot. And they built a sort of a cross at the top of that hill, which you can't see very well in this picture actually. And they've actually got some trees with his name displaying on it as well. So there are many different legends about Putna and about its founding, but that's probably the most well-known one. Stephen the Great, we'll talk about him in a bit more depth in a moment, but on his orders, the monastery was founded and it was consecrated in 1470. The main monastery church, as I say, was dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God and always has been. The church was damaged quite badly by a fire in about 1484. They don't know exactly how much, but there's certainly evidence, archaeological evidence of a fire around that time. Later on in the 17th century, it gets rebuilt again. A Moldavian ruler called Vasile Lupu wants to rebuild the church, and he basically takes it apart down to the foundations. But then, unfortunately, the Cossacks invade, and he gets a little bit waylaid with the Cossacks for a while. And so it doesn't really happen for a while, and that gets a bit drawn out. But it is rebuilt later in the 17th century. And then it undergoes a number of different restorations throughout the years. Quite significantly, it was restored during the communist period between the 1950s and the 1970s. And I think that probably says something about the prominence of the place, given that a lot of monasteries had a pretty hard time with it during that time. And so, many churches and places were destroyed as well. So to have a place actually being renovated during that time says something about its place, I think, in the national consciousness. It's also been used as a place to take foreign dignitaries as well. So it was in 1992, after communism, it was the first place that King Michael visited since leaving the country in 1948. And it was visited by many Romanian monarchs prior to that, and indeed many of them helped to create some of the monastery connections and the museum. And in 2010, most recently, work started on repainting the interior of the monastery church, which we'll have a look at in a bit as well. So it's some quite substantial work, really, there to completely repaint the interior. This is a couple of quick views of the old church. So the old monastery, and it really does look very old in those pictures. It dates from about the mid-14th century, and it was taken apart from this little town around here, and taken apart really piece by piece and transported over to Putna and put back together here. And it is still there. I don't know if it is actually, are you able to visit it?
Yes.
You can visit it. Great. I don't think I've been it. No. But it is still there. And it's the burial place, as I say, of Dragoș Voda, who was the first, seen as the first voivod of Moldavia in the 14th century. But you can't say anything about Putna without talking about Saint Stephen the Great, or Ștefan cel Mare, as it's called in Romania. And he was canonized as a saint in 1992. He lived, as I said, in a time of great upheaval, and he is really a warrior prince. But he is known principally for building at least 25 churches in the area, which can be sort of documentary. There's evidence to actually link them to him, but it's likely that there are very many more links to him. And depending on who you ask, some say 25, some say 50, some say, I don't know. The point is, he built an awful lot of churches. And another one of the legends is that he would consecrate, or he would found a church or a monastery for every battle which he fought and won. And he is known, as I say, as a warrior prince, and known for having fought something like 36 battles against, as I say, all sorts, from the Hungarians of Matthias Corvinus to the Sultan Mehmed II himself, and he's known to only have lost 2. So he's seen as a great military leader and a great sort of Romanian, Moldovan, if you like, patriot, as well as a founder of churches. He's also, at the time, he donated to the rebuilding of the Zograf monastery on Athos. So it's quite an early sort of Moldovan link to Mount Athos there as well. During his time, he was described as a champion of Christ by Pope Sixtus IV. And so he was known in the West at the time as well. And in 2004, the Ecumenical Patriarch actually visited Putna, and Patriarch Bartholomew placed a gift of a silver candle at the tomb of St. Stephen the Great, which is what you can see in this picture. So we can see that is actually where he's buried. I think that's a replica of his crown, and I think the actual one is in the museum. And so, yes, a huge figure in Romanian history, and as I say, in the history of ethnic Romanians in Ukraine and Republic of Moldova as well. Here's a map of some of the monasteries that he founded, and it's quite an old one. It's not particularly easy to read, but you can see that, right from what is the Cherna Woods, which is now in Ukraine, all the way down to Cetate Alba, which is actually also now in Ukraine on the Black Sea. He built or founded a lot of different monasteries or monuments or palaces, if you like. So an awful lot of history related to him around here. And there's also a bit of a link between the monastery and the poet Mihai Eminescu, who you may be familiar with. In August 1971, 3,000 representatives of from all over Romania came to Putna, which at that time was not part of Romania, it was still separated from Romania, being part of Bukovina. And he read a poem out on the day to all of the people who were assembled, which was essentially the poem calls for St. Stephen the Great to arise and to inspire the people of Romania and to reunite Bukovina and reunite Moldova together. And Eminescu named Putna the Jerusalem of the Romanian people. So it's often referred to as the Jerusalem of the Romanian people. And as I say, that's still very much relevant today. Even people speak about the Republic of Moldova today as occupied territory. So there's still a huge conscious in Romania of people who that very much I think they still see that historical regions are still at least from a cultural perspective parts of one people. What I would like to do now is actually just very briefly play a video, which I will not play in full. I'll just play this first sort of minute or so of it. And it has a few views of the interior of the church, because I'd like to now turn to some of the icons and the iconography and some of the arts, and just give you a bit of a taster. So we saw some interior views of the main monastery church. There are other chapels, if you like. There are some outside, there are some skeets. There's the old monastery, and just behind the church, actually, here is the museum, and slightly to the right-hand side, blocks the view here by the church, there's a chapel. So that is, the chapel is often used for some of the lesser sort of everyday services, and for Sundays and feasts, the main church tends to be used. But to go back to some of the icons, in front of the iconostasis is an icon to the Mother of God, which is said to be a miracle-working icon, and which is, I think it was originally in the iconostasis, but it was taken out, I suppose, so it could be displayed and so it could also be processed. And it is, as you can see, it is kind of covered with a silver plate, and the painting style is sort of more kind of realist type of painting style. And you can see, in fact, some of what we're going to talk about in a moment is really quite well displayed by the contrast between the style of the icon that is put in front, which is painted much more recently, most probably in the icon workshop of the monastery itself, and some of the icons behind, the miracle-working icon of the Mother of God. This icon is from the iconostasis, which was made in about 1773, which hopefully you can get a view of the iconostasis. Maybe I will have a look on the next slide. But as I say, it was a more sort of realistic style, and the reason for that, again, is partially to do with the different influences that had come into Romania. But let me talk about the other painting, which is in the main church first. So, as I said, this has been relatively recently repainted throughout the whole church. So, if you have been to Putna, but perhaps not within the last decade, I suppose, it might have looked somewhat different to this, and it has been restored quite significantly. And the style that you find is, I don't know if I'm not an expert in iconography, but it sort of strikes me as something of a mix between the realism which they have in some of their older icons and Byzantine style, maybe perhaps something like the Cretan school of iconography or something like that. That is, it feels like it's a little bit unique to Romania. They certainly feel like they have their own sort of style. So you can see here the icon of the Domitian, and it's a sort of cross between, it's not quite total realism, although the garments and the architecture somewhat show that, and the facial expressions of the saints. But there is a little sort of element of it. Some elements were obviously this was painted quite later. The reason that it was repainted was because the original the painting was in quite a bad state. I think probably in the post-communist times in general, there's been something of a rebirth in Romania of this style of painting. I don't know if you would agree. But most of the new churches that you go to, and if you see any churches that are built or are repainted these days, they will tend to have this style of painting, rather than some of the style of iconography that you see in some of the older monasteries. So we have some pictures of, again, that icon of the Mother of God, and we have a few pictures here of the iconostasis as well. So as I say, the iconostasis is from the 18th century. Some of the icons in it are actually even later than that, painted by, I think, a Ukrainian or a Russian painter, such as the icon here of the Saints Peter and Paul. And you can see again, it's from their garments and from perhaps their facial expressions and things like that. It's a little bit more kind of realist. And the icon of the Mother of God in the middle there, I believe, is the only icon that actually survived the original fire in the 15th century. So that is a very old icon, and it's possibly older than that, I think. There may even be a sort of a restoration, and there may even be a sort of layer of paint underneath that dates from even before. And I quite, in some ways, I quite like the contrast between the style that you have in the iconostasis and the style that you can see that has been repainted into the church, because As I say, most of the Romanian churches nowadays that get renovated or built will use that much more sort of Byzantine style of iconography. And in a sense, if they're all painted in that way, you know, you could almost feel when you walk into one of them, you could be in almost any of them to some extent. And so it's nice to, I think this type of thing provides a little bit of a snapshot in history. The reason, as I say, is you know, this influence from Ukrainian and Russian painters, but also Romania was a little bit of a highway for artists that were coming up through Greece or Italy en route to Russia to paint there. And they were often sort of nabbed by the local Romanian rulers to do a few jobs on their way up, including maybe just quickly paint an iconostasis. So, as you do. And so there's the added sort of factor is that a lot of the local painters, even up until the sort of 17th, 18th century, would go to places like Italy to study. So they would bring back a kind of Renaissance style with them. But nowadays, in terms of iconography, there is actually an icon workshop in the monastery, and it's not usually open to visitors, but when we did a guided sort of tour of the monasteries about 5 years ago, we were lucky enough to actually go in and see some of the things that they were doing, some of the things they were painting, some of the projects that the icons rather that they were working on, the colours where they'd been getting the paints from, and all of that type of thing. And so there are some monks whose service, if you like, is to paint icons. And they paint them for the monastery itself, but also for churches all around Romania and beyond. They donated 16 icons to the new National Cathedral in Bucharest, which you might have seen, I think was consecrated last year. Actually, though, Putna was known historically not for icon painting as much as for embroidery. So in the museum of the monastery, you can find all sorts of liturgical vestments, all sorts of altar vessels, all sorts of items, gospel books and covers, and you could spend hours, quite frankly, talking just about the museum and the collection of the museum. There has always been some sort of collection at the monastery of various items that were either donated to it or created there, but it was really brought together in the late 19th century into a sort of proper collection, and the early 20th century. And the museum fully established under King Carol II in the 1930s. It was renovated and restored again in 2004 on the 500th anniversary of Stephen the Great's passing away. And so you can see from the picture, it's a relatively modern building. If you go at a quiet time, so probably not around a feast or a weekend, you can probably get a tour from one of the monks if there is a monk available. Quite a few of the monks actually speak English. It's very much worth doing. So just talk a little bit about the life of the monastery. You can see there's a monk being tonsured up on the top left here. You can see that from the prominence of Putna and its position, the fact that it has been, its position in the sort of the Carpathian Mountains, the fact that it has a number of sort of agricultural lands and terrains around it, there's quite a wide variety of things that the monks actually spend their time doing. You know that they have quite an industrial level of agriculture at the moment. It's not uncommon to see a monk driving a tractor in full monastic garb. But you know, there's bell ringing. There's guided tours, working in the monastery shop. You can see a monk there working with grapevines. You can see some woodwork there as well. There's the icon school, the museum. And I think I'm right in saying that there are roughly about 100 monastics. The abbot is Father Melchizedek, and he's actually been the abbot for some time, I think since 1992. So he is also himself actually quite well known throughout Romania for his homilies. Do you have anything that you wanted to say in terms of memories of Putna, or what you used to do as a child?
I used to go there since I was 14 or 15, so I can't recollect, to be honest. I went many times, and I used to be the annoying child sometimes. I used to go to the kitchen and help them to cook, because so Morys mentioned lots of work they do, but they also do cooking. So sometimes the people from the village come with goods because they can't have fish or other things, so they trade. So they have meat, and they can't eat the meat. So they trade with the locals of Putna. They give the meat to the locals, and the locals give them other goods like fish or cheese or other things. And I always used to get the fresh things out of the kitchen, so to say. I used to camp there a lot because, as you could see, there's so beautiful landscape area there. You could stay easily. And I want also to mention, not to forget, the road ends on the monastery. So if you ever want to visit, you can't escape, you can't miss it. You just end up in the monastery, basically. So the roads get you to it. What I could, sometimes it's very beautiful to see people coming around with their national costumes, and maybe we can talk about later. But I had always a good experience and good moments with the surrounded with the priest. They're very busy, always very busy, but they always make time to speak with children. They love children. I learned a lot from them, and maybe not historically much. I've learned much later, but in terms of culture, in terms of worship and things, they very much in to help you, to guide you, and to get you your path where you wish you to go through.
Thank you. Some tips for the virtual pilgrim. So if we're not able to get to places like Putna these days, what can we do? I'll send this around later, I'm sure. There are some books on Putna and other monasteries which I would recommend. There are not all that many things available in English, actually, about Putna and even about the area and the monasteries here. But these three are definitely good companions, if you like. So the first one is a really huge book about just about everything you could possibly want to know about the monastery, quite honestly. Its history, the life of the monks, the architecture. It's available from the monastery website and from its bookshop. Second one is not from the monastery. It is published by a regular publisher, but it's called Medieval Monuments of Bukovina. And if you ever wanted to come and visit this region, I think this is probably one of the best books you can get in English as an introductory guide to the region. So it has the chronology, it has some maps, it has some recommended routes and things as well. And it has a very nice introduction, not just to the history, but also to the different frescoes that you see in each of the monasteries, the different icons. And so it really is a great way to sort of pick out the things that you might want to visit before you come. And then the final one is about the embroidery, which I mentioned a little bit in the sort of piece of the history there. And you can see a lot of the examples in the book. You can see in the museum as well. On a final note, there are some online resources, if you like, and things that you can access about Putna. Orthodox Radio is a radio station which actually streams services from Putna live. So they've been doing that for, I want to say about, I don't know, about 5 years, maybe more?
Maybe more.
Probably more than that, actually. And when there are no services, it just plays some very nice chanting, sometimes from Putna, sometimes from elsewhere. But it also, on every feast day and every Sunday, they will live stream a service. And so you can see coming up, if you wanted to listen to something from Putna, you have on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Romanian time, which is 7 a.m. UK time, unfortunately, you can listen to the liturgy of the Dormition, if you would want to. And the monastery actually has a pretty good website in English as well, so it has quite a comprehensive website which tells you a fair bit about the history, it tells you a fair bit about the iconography, and as I mentioned as well, it also has a bookshop. I think that is it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think both of us would definitely welcome any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Morys and Andrea, for adding in your personal recollections as well. I think that's really special for us to hear that, actually, as well as seeing the beautiful images of the monastery. I do encourage people to put questions in the chat box if you have them, and I will come to that. But I'm going to take the chairman's advantage of going first. And you mentioned that some of the monasteries in Bukovina are very famous because they are painted. And we saw in the background sometimes of your pictures some of those monasteries. They're painted, for those who don't know, they're painted in the sense that the outside walls are frescoed. And I just wondered why Putna, being, you know, the biggest of them all, if you like, is not frescoed on the outside.
That's a very good question, Margaret. Thank you. And so it was painted. It was painted as the others, but unfortunately, it had many. It was a problem with the fire. Lots of Tartars has destroyed, pretty much has been destroyed for many, many years, and very little has been recollected and very little has restored. So unfortunately, it has disappeared completely. Nevertheless, I remembered vaguely from one of the priests I used to talk with him and said, the winters are pretty harsh there. And that could have been another effect of destroying and not easily to be kept. And then also they suffered in 1700, I'm not sure exactly, an earthquake. And that's another thing that could have destroyed a little bit, but they're not sure. So nothing has been able to contend, but it was painted. One of the chronicles, Nikolai was saying that it was so beautiful, it was painted with much gold, but they say because there was so much gold into that paint, it could have been stolen by the Tartars. So we don't know yet. So there's stories and legends, but there was. So there's some history part. They're saying it was painted.
And the ones that remain that are painted, you definitely see on the tends to be the north-facing walls, the effect of the winter. The other walls tend to be a
bit better. Yes.
Thank you. Phil has made a couple of comments which are not really phrased as questions, but might sort of prompt you to talk a bit about this. He says that the chanting is very like, so the chanting that we heard on the videos, the chanting is very like an authentic recording of Messe de Notre Dame by Guillaume de Machaut. It's a medieval French mass, and he thought it was an interesting kind of mix, given that you were talking about the Gothic influence as well. I wondered, since he hasn't actually posed a question, I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit more about the chanting. Is there anything special about the chanting at Putna as opposed to other monasteries, or you know, is it seen as a light of Byzantine chanting, because that's what we heard, or do they do other styles of singing as well? It'd be really interesting to hear that.
As far as I know, and it's ever seen, I've been since I was 14, as I said, they all use this chanting. This is their style. This is the way they do, and I never had the change of it. And it's completely different from the other monasteries, indeed. But I don't know how much to say, but there's.
I remember that you were saying that when you were a child, and some of the churches, they still used to use the sort of Russian style chanting. Yeah. So I wonder if, again, it's almost part of, as we see with some of the frescoes, I wonder if it's almost part of this similar sort of Byzantine revival that has been going on, a trend towards that that tendency in both the iconography and also in the chanting.
Yeah.
I always feel that Romania, in many ways, is stuck somewhere between Greece and Russia, and can't quite make its mind up.
In the best possible way, of course.
The best possible way. I think you can choose the best of both.
Yeah. Great. There's a question from Maria Julian, who has said, she was asking about the relics at the monastery. So obviously there was the tomb of St. Stephen, but I think in the video there was also a relic of Saint Gennady, or I think yes, another saint.
That's right.
Are there other relics there? What's the kind of history of that?
So this is the only relics exist in the monastery. It's Saint Gennady. This saint has been actually brought by Stephen the Great. It is only his head. There's not much, the whole relics, which is only his head. There was some history part of, they're not sure it was the Gennady II or Gennady I. Now they have a bit of, because it's brought such early days, they don't know if it's the first or the second, but it's definitely Gennady, Saint Gennady in there.
Yeah. And I suppose the spiritual father of Stephen the Great, Father Daniel.
Daniel, yeah.
I suppose his relics must be there as well, as far as I know.
And just a follow-up question: the tomb, the picture of the tomb that you showed, had two boys in traditional dress standing either side. Is that a permanent thing, or is that just on feast days, or?
It's pretty much on the feast days, but also on the big days, sort of Sundays and days. Yes, you can definitely see people dressing like this. This is the actual national costume. For men, they use it. For ladies, it's completely different. But we can show you some pictures if you like. I want to say a little legend here that I know from one of the monks. I'm not sure if it's true, but if you ever want to go, they might say the Stephen. There is his tomb there. Stephen the Great is his tomb there. He might not be buried. He might be buried at the entrance of the church, because the Stephen the Great said he was so humbled. He wanted to be under people, stepped by under people, because he wanted to be with the people even he's dead. So it might be a story, it might not be, you might hear it.
That's really interesting. A lot of people are nervous about walking over tombs, aren't they? So that would be quite interesting. Oh, wonderful. I think we can hear the children in the background. We say, everyone says hello.
We're being invaded by some people.
It's okay. We've had a question about the hospitality of the monastery. Now, obviously, anyone can go and visit during the day and for the services. But do they offer hospitality overnight for women as well as men?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't mind being there, staying there for many, many years. There is a place you can stay but can be separated, and it can be for welcome by the church without paying. So you can go there and worship and stay present at the liturgies and vespers and all the prayers, so you don't have to pay. Nevertheless, if you go with a group or with a family, you don't want to be apart from your children, there is a hotel actually called the Monastery Hotel of Putna, and you can stay together. But of course, that will be a payment, not as much, but they take it as a donation. It's not very expensive. It's easy to stay there and to be part of it. As well as next to the hotel, there's little huts, very beautiful huts that you can camp. Or even further out, you can stay in a tent. So as much as adventurous you could be, from very easy to go there and not pay and be helped, and also to pay for it. When I always go there, I don't pay, and I've been welcomed with food for free. But if I do that, I always help them in many ways, like in things like they need it around the monastery.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions, so I'm trying to get through as many as we can. Someone's asked, Philip has asked, on the slide of the tomb of St. Stephen, there was the word voivod, which features, and we were just checking, what does that mean? What title is that, and who does that apply to?
Yes, so really it's generally translated into English as prince, or some sort of ruler, but voivod is a Slavic word in origin, and it essentially basically just means a lord or a ruler. He's also uses the title Dom, which means lord, so Lord of Moldova. So it's kind of hard to translate in English because at that time those titles are used interchangeably and in various different sort of principalities. But essentially it basically just means a prince or ruler.
Thank you. That's helpful. We've had two questions, one from Elizabeth and one from Veronica, about the communist period and what happened. Did the monastery, was it able to continue being a monastery during that period? You mentioned about the restoration happening during that time, but did they actually have to close? Were there any martyrs, or were people imprisoned, as happened in other places in Romania?
So I think maybe I'm hopefully not speaking out of turn saying it, but I think in comparison with what I understand and I've read from elsewhere and heard from people elsewhere, I think Putna was relatively blessed during that time. Obviously, it was a difficult time for everybody, and I think the first years of communism were particularly harsh all round. But as we saw that restoration started from even sort of the 1950s, they started talking about restoring it in the 60s and 70s, and actually went and did a lot of restoration. And part of the reason for that, I think there are probably at least two things. One thing is that it has such a place in the national consciousness. It would be like, I don't know, somebody coming to power in England and saying they were going to knock down Salisbury Cathedral or something like that. I don't think that would go down terribly well. And you can imagine even the most despotic of regimes might have a hard time doing that. So to some extent there's that. And then to some extent there, again, because of its prominence, some of the local church hierarchs were quite high up in the hierarchy, if you like. So the Metropolitan of Moldova later went on to be Patriarch of Romania, which is not the first time that that's happened. And so in a sense, it benefited from the patronage and what little power and influence the hierarchy had, and they could probably use it. And then I suppose the other element of it is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's been a place to bring foreign dignitaries, if you like. So I would imagine it would have been a place where they could perhaps bring people and sort of show off a little bit of cultural heritage. But in general, yes, I can't imagine that it was an easy time for anybody. But I think that
might be contracted in size, fewer monks, but somehow
very
continue.
Very likely, and you know, I generally wouldn't have been allowed to give public homilies and all of that type of thing. So they would have had the same restrictions as everyone else, but they certainly didn't suffer quite as much destruction as perhaps some other places had.
Yeah. Phil has asked about the wonder-working icon of the Mother of God, and whether there's anything you can say more about that, perhaps something about some of the miracles which are attributed to the icon.
Yes. Yeah, so that icon, maybe I should share my screen and bring it back up again, just to remind us. So that icon, as I say, was part of the iconostasis and was taken out. And it was, there have been a few different miracles associated with it, but one of which was in the early 1990s, I think something like 1992 or 1993, where the Archbishop of Suceava and Woods, Archbishop Pieman, who sadly passed away earlier this year due to coronavirus, rather horribly, but it was quite old as well, was praying in front of it with another priest or another bishop, I can't remember exactly, and they were praying for some 3 specific Christians who were ill, and those Christians were miraculously healed from an illness which I think otherwise would have been rather unlikely for them to have been healed. And this was, I think, the first instance, and then a separate instance happened as well. So it's essentially been attributed to the intercession of the Mother of God for the people who have been commemorated in prayer in front of that icon. And since that original occurrence, further miracles have been attested, and that is why it's called the miracle working icon of the Mother of God. And that's when you sort of look up Putna online, you'll see that is one of the most prominent images that is used. And indeed, I think when I showed the picture of the website, it's right up there on their homepage. It's almost like their emblem, if you like. Tell me.
There's another little story about in here, a legend. So one of the monks said to me, they say it started to become miracle, icon of miracle, because if you look closely, you'll see the angel in white, wherever the Mother of God and the Christ is in black, in kind of brown. Some say a black couple came to pray to Mother of God because she couldn't have children. And she prayed and said, Mother of God, why are you white? Because we are black. And in that moment, some of the monks said it turned black. As you can see, like slightly brown and not white. So they don't know if it's true. They say some say it's very true. Some say it could be from what happened in the church being a fire. But I think this is how they realize it become Mother of God, making miracles.
Thank you. We've had a question from Father Alexander, and it's about the celebration of the Dormition, and it's a real blessing that we're talking about Putna so close to its patronal feast, and whether there's anything different in the celebration from what we might have here or elsewhere in the Orthodox world. Are there particular traditions at the monastery for the feast of the Dormition?
I don't know. That's a very good question.
That's one for you.
Unfortunately, I've been, but I don't remember. I think it's been such a long time. The only thing I would say differently is they don't do it inside, because being such a nice weather, it's August. We are blessed with August, so we always kind of have hot weather and very little rain, or if it rains, is bearable. So they're doing outside. They create a big scene, I don't know how to say, a big place. So all the priests and the other priests from other churches are coming as well. They invited from all the country or all the county, depends if they can. That I could say they do completely different. And then sometimes the bishop is coming. I don't know if there's a new bishop coming, but there's the one who we have it, unfortunately. Yeah, that's it. That's the only thing I could add.
And do they have a procession? I have seen other pictures of other processions at other monasteries in Romania. I wonder whether there's a tradition of that as well. You mentioned that maybe the icon, miracle working icon, was brought out partly because it could be taken in procession.
Not on this day. I don't remember. Maybe.
But certainly a very big celebration with people from everywhere.
Yes. Very, very big celebration. It is in. Sorry, I don't know what to say.
I think the size of the celebrations is somewhat given away by the size of the car park, which is just about as big as the monastery.
Yeah.
We'll take a couple more questions, and then I think we should probably let you rest because it's getting late where you are. But Daniel has asked why they painted over the old frescoes, so inside the church. I think he mentioned that they had deteriorated, but obviously rather than restoring what was there, they have painted new. Do you know why that decision was made?
Well, I remember when I was a child, I was 10 years old, and it was nothing painted. It was completely white, the wall, as you can see outside. It was very little to say left. Maybe you might be able to see, but I don't think so. They decided to it was not able to restore it. It was completely not able to restore it. So they did it over it, but it was nothing. It was completely gone. So I remember that very well.
That must have been a real surprise and wonderful moment when you went in when it had been completed.
Yes, it was, because I kind of liked it how it was. It was really strange because I saw everything happening. I was like, what's going on? Oh, they're repainting it. Okay. Yes.
I should say that, you know, Putna is very fortunate that it has so much attention and so much prominence, but there are a great many other monasteries in the area, which some of them are just in the middle of nowhere. Some of them are, you know, they're not necessarily always open to visits. You need to kind of contact somebody who has a key or something like that. The historical ones. And many of them do not benefit at all from that much restoration. And so, you know, really encourage you to go and visit and see them, and to encourage other people too, so that they hopefully get on the map a bit more. Because a lot of them, you know, Putna is a great example, but there are lots of them that are in need of similar levels of restoration and preservation.
That sort of leads on to the question which has come in from Stephen, which is, for someone wanting to make a pilgrimage to the various monasteries in this part of Romania, how do you recommend getting there and travelling around? Very practical question.
Yes, well, don't do what we did in June, which was to drive here. So that took rather a long time. I'll share my screen again very briefly. I would say probably the easiest way to get here. There is now, and it has been since the last, well, again, I don't know, 5-6 years, an airport.
No, 2 years, very new.
Yeah,
2, 3 years. Gosh. Yeah. And I was little, so 3 years.
Maybe a couple of years. There is an airport in Suceava, so you can fly to Suceava from Luton. And so that's definitely the best place to fly to. The nearest airports other than that, so there is one in this little town here called Bacău. And other than that, you're probably looking at Bucharest,
very far out,
or Iași. So I would say fly to Suceava and then stay. Suceava itself, there are an awful lot of monasteries and churches in the town, but if you want to see the sort of the traditional painted monasteries of Bucovina, I would say stay somewhere closer to where we are at the moment, which is called Pradaoț or Guru Humor, because they are quite well placed as sort of being in the middle. You can then go out in all directions and do a bit of a sort of route around that whole area. So that's definitely.
It's a case of driving around the area, though, isn't it?
Yes. Again, Putna is fortunate in that it has actually got a train station, which has come back into use again in the last couple of years.
Last year.
But even then, it's only got sort of like 2 trains a day or something like that, and they're very slow. So you really need a car, unfortunately, to get around to most of them.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to treat this as our last question, unless anyone has any last minute ones they want to quickly type into the chat box. But Veronica has asked, are there any famous elders associated with the monastery?
Yes, Father Jeremiah, he is quite good priest, and he knows very well English because he has studied in USA. When we did the tour 5 years ago, I have managed to speak with him, but he is very, very busy, unfortunately, because he also looks after other people and confesses. He's a confessor as well. And actually, I wanted to speak live with us, but he said, I have no time. I have to prepare for the feast. So he could have been with us, but he couldn't. And then he didn't have enough time to give me certain advice, but he's the only one he could get to know more and to give you more about Putna.
That's right. I think one thing that he said to us when he gave us a talk on that visit that we did, there were quite a few things that he says that I thought were very, very special, but there was one thing that remains with me particularly, which was he was talking about the need to pray for everything that we have need for in our lives, essentially. Every little thing, and every time you sort of change direction and do something else, to pray to the Mother of God, to pray to the Lord for help. And as a demonstration, he said, I think he had a pencil or something like that, and he said, you know, you can move this pencil from here over to there, can't you? And he said, you know, there's no doubt you don't need God's help to do that. And I sort of said, well, yes, you know, well, of course I can. And he said, well, can you do it without losing any of the grace that you gained at your baptism? And you kind of think, yeah, well, I'm not sure that I can. And it was just a very interesting kind of figure that remained with me for some reason, about, you know, everything that we do in our lives, and how it has a sort of much greater significance, even the small things, and how, you know, we need that help to acquire and to retain God's grace. I think as well is quite nice in that is relatively young, but still he knew some of the older generation of Romanian fathers, who, most of which I think are no longer alive, who went through the sort of communist gulags and things, like Father Arsenie Papachok. And so he grew up you know, listening to them, and I think he's passing on that very strong tradition of spiritual fathers who went through that time.
Well, I haven't had any more questions in, and I think that's actually a really lovely place to leave it. I want to say thank you again so much for speaking to us about Putna, for giving us the maps. I appreciated the maps, but also just the context. And I don't think I'd realised how much of a crossroads Putna and Bukovina and that area, Suceava, were and still are. And I feel like that's really come across in what you've been saying. It's a really beautiful place, and I do hope people have the opportunity to go and visit in the future. A quick reminder to everyone that we are accepting donations, which we will split between the monasteries that we are visiting through these sessions. I put the link in the chat, but if you lose that when we finish the call, the link is also on our website where you registered for details. Next week, we will be visiting Russia, and we will be going to Putna Monastery, which in this series is the only one I have actually visited. So I'm very excited to see it again, and I hope you will enjoy it too. There have been some comments in the chat just to say to everyone, saying thank you for a lovely presentation and an interesting visit. I hope lots of people will have the opportunity to visit Putna in the future. And thank you again, Andreea and Morys. And I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Bye.